I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican, in that order.
Indiana Governor Mike Pence was my first choice.
Elections are about choices, and I also joined this ticket because the choice could not be more clear. The stakes could not be higher. I know from firsthand experience that strong Republican leadership can bring about real change, just like we've seen in the Hoosier State.
This is the IBJ Podcast. I'm Mason King, and of course we're talking today about Mike Pence. He's a former congressman and governor of Indiana. He's currently a vice president. The whole country knows of him, but I think he's still a bit of a mystery to most Americans. He has a very carefully crafted persona, which we're going to try to push aside today or deconstruct a little bit. With me is Andrea Neal, a longtime Indiana journalist who has written really the first, I think, substantive biography of Pence, with dozens of original interviews. Hey, Andrea, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure.
Hey, thanks for coming. Now, the book to be released later this summer is called Pence, The Path to Power. Apparently, the typesetter had sales on the letter P. I'm going to kick off the question with what I thought was going to be the last question. And maybe this will illuminate the conversation as we go forward. Maybe it doesn't. So the vice president declined your request for an interview, which is, not a giant surprise. But if he were to call up today, or if he had called up 3 months ago and said, Andrea, I'm telling you what, I'm going to answer one question and I'm going to answer it fully and I'm going to answer it honestly. What is the thing that you would want to know from Mike Pence, about Mike Pence?
Wow, that's an interesting question because I had prepared 60 questions for him, some that were fact-based and some that were, I guess I would describe as more emotional. Honestly, if I could only ask him one question, I think I would ask, why did you say yes?
Why did you say yes to Trump?
Why did you say yes to Donald Trump? I have everybody else's take on that. I have Rex Early quoted in the book saying, well, of course he said yes to Donald Trump. How many chances was he going to get to be vice president? This was it. He would have said yes to anybody. That's Rex Early's take on it. I have other sources in the book saying he'd really been preparing for something like this for a lifetime. Many people thought his career was sunk, even as he was running for a second term as governor. And so some say he said yes because his career was sunk. He wasn't even going to win re-election. And so I have all these theories, but I would, if I knew I'd get an honest answer, I think that's what I'd ask him.
Do you think you know what he would say?
I don't think he would say what Rex Early said, but I think Rex Early's answer is the truth.
Yeah.
And that is, how many chances was he going to get at this point in his career?
Mm-hmm. What is it that makes him so well suited for this job? I mean, if you accept that he is well suited for this job, and since he still appears to be in the president's races, you have to assume that he's doing a good job.
Well suited. I think he's a master politician. He is a career politician. Really, he hasn't had a lot of other jobs, if you look back, and the jobs that he did have, working as the executive director of a public policy think tank and being the host of a talk radio show, were jobs that made him even better suited for a career in politics. So he loves the grip and grin. He doesn't forget names. He's been compared to Bill Clinton in the sense that when he's talking to you, if he's really talking to you, he's making eye contact that makes you feel important. He loves people, and I heard many a story of from friends who would travel the state with him, either when he was in Congress or as governor, and he just got pure joy out of being either on the campaign trail or on the fried chicken circuit. He loves talking to people. Now, we're not seeing that from him right now because he's kind of hidden away, but that was a story that was told me time after time.
I don't know a lot about Pence. I didn't follow him a lot when he was a congressman. I wasn't in the state at the time. So I know really Mike Pence from his years as governor, now as vice president. I look at him and I see what he is projecting and what I'm assuming he is choosing to project, which is an image of like super Boy Scout. Like literally, if you go through the Boy Scout creed, you've got loyal, cheerful, thrifty, reverent. I mean, if there has been a more reverent person, I've never seen them in my life. How much of what we see of the Pence persona really is Mike Pence?
Yeah, I think that is the genuine Mike Pence. I think it also is a strategy to be that way. So, I mean, how you separate them, I'm not sure. But if you go back to his childhood, he was a good kid. He liked to have fun. He liked to go to movies. He apparently was very popular with the girls, and he had a lot of girlfriends. But he goes to Hanover College, which had a very vibrant fraternity scene, and he becomes the president of a fraternity, and he'll occasionally have a beer. He was never a big drinker. Now he doesn't drink at all. Once he was elected to office, he quit. But he does have sort of the Boy Scout motto as his life creed. And I think some people think it's all an act. I don't think it's an act. His friends to a person describe him as a decent, honest person. I think he was his most genuine self when he was in Congress. And he was playing a minority role, either minority because the Republicans held the minority, or minority because his perspective in the Republican caucus was not the majority perspective. But that's when we saw him really battling hardest for his free market, conservative Republican ideas, and saying it aggressively, even to people within his own party, not worrying so much about making friends or making enemies, as he would come to do later in his political career. But no, I think the Boy Scout persona is not an act. I think it's the real thing, but it's also a political strategy.
And strategy in what way?
Well, that's how he sold himself. That's how he sold himself to Donald Trump. It's why Donald Trump and Trump's family liked him. They could not have been more different. And to the extent that Trump knew he was going to face questions about his lifestyle, his multiple marriages, his owning of casinos, he's got to, as a great contrast, this Boy Scout owns no property, has no financial interests that are ever going to get him into ethical trouble. In fact, when the Pences were selected by the Trumps, one of the things that intrigued Donald Trump was that he had no money, no home, and no assets. You can't get in much trouble when you don't have financial assets.
So let's back up a little bit. Who are you and what do you do?
Oh, me? You're talking to me?
That's right, you.
So I used to be a full-time journalist, and now I call myself a part-time journalist and a full-time teacher.
Okay.
I was the editorial page editor of the Indianapolis Star when I decided I'd had a second calling, and I became a teacher at St. Richard's Episcopal School. I teach 6th grade English and 8th grade U.S. history. But I've never stopped writing. I've written occasional public policy columns for the Indiana Policy Review, and written a book called Road Trip, A Pocket History of Indiana for the state's bicentennial, which allowed me to travel the whole state and see all sorts of landmarks I'd never seen before, despite being a lifelong Hoosier. So that's what I do.
Okay. And what would you describe as your political persuasion?
My political persuasion, I don't share it with my students, and I'm reluctant to share it with you. I feel like it's irrelevant to the book. Now, when I was editorial page editor of the Indianapolis Star, I think you could document that we were a fairly conservative, free market editorial page. Mm-hmm. So, to the extent that I, would be labeled, that's probably how I'd be labeled.
All right. Should we read this book though as a conservative's interpretation of Mike
I hope
Pence?
not. What I told the IU Press I wanted to write was an objective, independent, neutral book that followed journalistic practices in the delivery. So I would read it as a non-biased, completely objective book. I offer a few opinions in the preface and a few opinions in the epilogue, but they're not political opinions per se.
Okay. And how did this come about?
I was in the car during my spring break driving to Chicago to see Hamilton, and out of the blue I got a phone call from Ashley Runyon, an editor at IU Press, saying, "We have an idea for a book." And I gave it a few days thought, but decided ultimately that it would be a huge privilege to write a biography of a sitting vice president.
And when was that? How long have you been working on this?
Not very long. I was on a 10-month contract.
Oh, wow.
So that was spring of 2017.
So what does this book going to tell us that we don't already know?
Well, first off, I think it puts the whole thing together. We've read lots of bits and pieces about Mike Pence's life, but this book takes us from his birth in Columbus to taking the oath of office as vice president in Washington, D.C. So I think we see the big picture. I think we'll be able to see a consistency to his life that he deviated from only occasionally, such as in the 1990 race when he sort of fell into some unethical practices. But so it puts the whole thing together. It talks to people who know him best, who have not really spoken about him before. I have on the record interviews with his 2 chiefs of staff. He really only had 2 chiefs of staff over his entire political career. And I learned things that they haven't told anyone else. For example, Donald Trump was considering him to be vice president back in June, even though his name did not pop up on anyone's radar screen in the media until July. And
2016.
2016, right. Exactly. He got a text from Steve Hilbert in June, the night before the Republican State Convention, saying, if you were considered to be Donald Trump's running mate, would you be open to it? And that was the very first he knew he was even being considered, was when he got that text from Steve Hilbert.
Now, how did Steve Hilbert know this? And this is Steve Hilbert, who,
yes.
just for everyone's memory, this was the founder and CEO of Conseco, the insurance company
that the man.
Eventually morphed into CNO Financial.
Yes. So Steve Hilbert is very good friends with Donald Trump. And they have been good friends since they got together in 1998 to rehab the General Motors building in New York City. And I never nailed down exactly when Hilbert and Pence became friends or friendly, but what I can tell you is in 1996, Mike Pence was doing a television show called Indie TV After Dinner, and he filmed one at the Hilberts' mansion in Carmel, and after that, the Hilberts gave Pence a few small, never huge campaign donors, but a few small campaign donations. So Steve Hilbert had known Trump and Pence both for a long time, and he was the go-between. And I don't think anyone knew that until my book.
Wow, that's fascinating. And so that was on Pence's mind for at least a month.
Yep, at least a month before Donald Trump offered him the spot.
Okay, so if you take us back then to, I think July 12th or so, when Trump comes through for a rally in Westfield,
I
believe.
Yeah.
So Pence has had some time to strategize.
He has had a lot of time, and Trump starts that day with a fundraiser at the Columbia Club, where he pulls Jeff Cardwell aside, the Republican state chairman at the time, and says, I've narrowed it down to Pence and Gingrich. Who would you pick and why? And Jeff Cardwell had his ear for a long time. Then they travel up to Westfield for this rally where Pence introduces Trump, does a knockout job, as dynamic a introduction as you could imagine, and takes on Hillary Clinton and shows this attack dog mode that he's capable of doing, and it really impressed Donald Trump. And then sort of the final evidence that Mike Pence was the right man for the job came overnight. So this was a pretty well-reported story at the time. Donald Trump's campaign plane had a flat tire on the tarmac at the airport, and whether they delayed the repair on purpose or whether it just took a long time to get apart, I can't say for sure, but Trump ended up spending the night and having the Pences for dinner at the Conrad. And then the Pences had the Trump family, others of whom flew in the meantime, to breakfast the next morning at the governor's residence. And apparently it was that extended visit that sealed the deal.
Right. What do we know about, the things that Mike Pence would have said to Donald Trump overnight? I think, were they at the Capitol Grill, which is literally a block away from here?
Yeah, they were at the Capitol Grill for dinner. Yeah, so I didn't have any sources that filled me in on that conversation. I think it's safe to say that Pence was seriously pursuing the job and making the case that he was the right person and why. So if I were guessing what Pence said, and this would be based on maybe some interviews I had with Jeff Cardwell, he would say, I've got the connections you need to win. I've got the evangelical Christians. They're going to be skeptical of you, but they're not skeptical of me, and I can vouch for you. I would guess that Pence said, I really have a strong base in the old industrial Midwest. I know all of the surrounding governors, and those governors are going to speak highly of me, and I can help you with them. And then finally, and some of the others, I mean, Newt Gingrich could have probably said this also, I've got friends in Congress who can help you get your agenda through. Paul Ryan and I are close friends. He might have said at that time, Jeff Flake and I are close friends, although that relationship became frayed. So I think he made the case: evangelical Christians, Midwest Rust Belt, and Capital connections.
Let's go to the very first line of this book. Speaking of almost fairy tale-like transformations, you say here this favorite movie is The Wizard of Oz.
Right.
And I don't know if you approach that anywhere else in the book. I didn't see it. What do you know about that? What's behind?
Why does he like The Wizard of Oz?
Yeah.
Yeah, why does anybody like that movie? It's one of my least favorites. I don't think there's any hidden reason. I think he just likes the movie for the characters and the great acting, and it's a great film that you watch with your kids when they're little. But yeah, I picked up on the yellow brick road imagery because he's followed quite a circuitous path to the vice presidency, and as we discussed earlier, there were even moments when people thought his career was over. In fact, several moments where people said, he's done, he's not going to be in politics again. And he keeps somehow getting back on the path, getting back on that yellow brick road, and made his way to the vice presidency.
So Pence is born in 1959. He grows up in Columbus, Indiana, which is an industrial town here in Indiana. Notable almost parenthetically, but very significantly for its architecture. His dad, Ed Pence, works for an oil company. Mike is the third of four brothers. Then his parents had two girls. What did Mike get from his parents?
Yeah, certainly his father was known for his work ethic, for being kind of a tough dad, a tough love kind of dad, and wanted the kids to go out and get jobs as early as they could, which Mike Pence did. He worked at a young age pumping gas at a marathon station, and when he wanted a guitar, he had to earn the money and buy his own guitar. The kids weren't coddled. They didn't have a lot of resources when the children were little. I show in the book 3 photographs of the Pence family homes in Columbus, and the evolution from that first home to the final home where they were living when Mike Pence went to college is quite remarkable. Clearly moving from what we would probably call lower middle class to upper class over Ed Pence's career at Keel Oil Brothers. He died, he was in his 50s when he died, so did not see Mike Pence go on to win election, but was involved in the very first unsuccessful campaign. So clearly the family had strong faith. They were active members of their Roman Catholic parish. I think the mother played a key role in that, and the family was close. The siblings seemed to be to get along, as siblings don't always, but they seem supportive of each other as children, and now they certainly seem supportive of each other as adults.
So he discovers pretty early on he enjoys public speaking and he's really good at it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I don't think I would call it an accident, but he was encouraged by teachers to enter some speaking contests even while a middle schooler, and really liked it. And he gets to Columbus North High School, which has a very active and successful speech and debate team, and he joins it again, finds encouragement from teachers and coaches. Have issues and you're concerned about maybe your self-image because of your weight, and you find success in something, it's a real pick-me-up. I think his speaking success was a huge pick-me-up. He won early. He continued to win speech contests throughout his high school career and went to a national contest. He lost that weight the summer between his freshman and sophomore year, was really motivated, went on a pretty strict summer diet and lost more than 50 pounds. So I think that we're going to have to credit his teachers with encouraging this talent.
The first thing that I thought of when I was reading about, his really marvelous success as a debater and thinking on his feet, was where was this kid when Mike Pence was being interviewed by George Stephanopoulos?
If a florist in Indiana refuses to serve a gay couple at their wedding, is that legal now in Indiana?
George, this is where this debate has gone with misinformation and frankly,
it's just a question, sir. Yes or no?
Well, there's been shameless rhetoric about my state and about this law and about its intention all over the internet.
Well, there are a couple of ironies in his career. That's one of them. I might point out the other one that seems really obvious too, but he rarely messed up broadcast interviews. He'd spent 7 years as a radio talk show host. He was skillful. He can be eloquent when making a speech. He thinks on his feet. One of his divisions was extemporaneous. You didn't find out the debate topic or the speech topic until a few minutes before you delivered it. And what happened there? His friends were perplexed at what happened there. He was not prepared for the number one question that George Stephanopoulos asked him about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and that was, will this lead to discrimination against gays? He didn't have an answer.
Yeah, and again, this was during his, probably really the most important aspect of his, at least infamous aspect of his role as governor.
Yeah, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which opponents said was a license to discriminate against gays. The supporters of the law said it was just an extra level or layer of protection for people to follow their sincerely held religious beliefs. Mike Pence supported that law. He didn't push it. It wasn't his bill. He signed it as governor, but then he became a outspoken advocate for it during those few days between the time he signed it into law and the Indiana legislature decided it had to be rewritten and fixed to avoid a huge economic backlash in Indiana. So that's an irony that at the moment he most needed his thinking on his feet skills, he didn't have them, and he didn't answer it right. He did not answer the question the way even the bill's authors thought he should have answered it.
Yeah.
Similar irony involves sort of free speech and speaking. This man has been a First Amendment advocate his entire life, going all the way back to childhood, and yet now he is the vice president in an administration that's known as kind of attacking the media and the First Amendment. And Mike Pence has been a part of the media. So a couple interesting ironies.
Yeah. I mean, certainly RFRA, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, I mean, jibed certainly with, I think, his religious beliefs. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yes, he supported it on the merits.
We'll get right back to Mason's interview with Andrea Neal about her book about Mike Pence. In the meantime, though, if you're enjoying what you hear, please subscribe to the IBJ Podcast at Google Play, iTunes, or TuneIn, or look for it at any of the other places you regularly find podcasts. Now, back to the podcast.
So let's go back. Is there a really formative moment in his religious evolution? And I'm, of course, thinking of a particular incident, but could you tell us about it?
That's probably the second question I would have asked him that I didn't get to ask him. He grew up as a faithful Catholic altar boy. In college, he had what would be described as a born-again experience, an epiphany, and accepted Jesus Christ as his personal Savior at a music festival in Kentucky. What led him to do that, I don't have the answer for. But those two different faith backgrounds mesh, both his Roman Catholicism and his evangelical Christianity mesh to explain his pro-life, anti-abortion positions, to explain his support of traditional man-woman marriage, to explain his opposition to Planned Parenthood and its abortion practices, his many of his social views naturally emanate from both Roman Catholicism and evangelical Christianity.
Well, that's a really interesting combination.
And I'm not sure he would say he's not a Roman Catholic anymore. He has somehow managed, although he has attended evangelical Protestant churches more recently as an adult, he has never denounced, renounced, rejected Roman Catholicism. And I think that life ethic, that pro-life ethic, began there. And his college friends indicate he was pro-life by the time he arrived at college. He's known to be a John Kennedy supporter as a young as an older child. And that, too, is kind of consistent.
He goes to college at Hanover College in southern Indiana. What was important about those years there?
Oh, so much. I think those were really formative and transformative. Certainly his politics changed. He entered freshman as what he would have called himself a Democrat. By the time he left as a senior, he was poised to become a Reagan Republican. And G.M. Curtis went by the name Jim Curtis, but it's actually George, a wonderful historian with libertarian tendencies, although Professor Curtis said that was not part of my classroom, but really exposed Mike Pence to the first time to constitutional history and federalism and states' rights theories and the thinking and the writings of the founding fathers. And I can speak from my own experience. When you get immersed in the rhetoric of the founding fathers, it's pretty hard not to fall in love with them and their ideas. And that's what happened to Mike Pence.
Mm-hmm. Was he interested in this because he was interested in politics, or did he become interested in politics because he fell in love with these concepts?
Yeah, so I'm going to say a little of both. I think he favored history and political science as fields of study, fields of interest. And I think that what he learned in Professor Curtis's class just turned him on and really set him on that path of inquiry. After he graduated from Hanover, he stayed in Madison for a few years and was an admissions officer. And it was during those years that he was able to talk to G.M. Curtis on I would say, a sort of more political level. His best friend was dating Professor Curtis's daughter, and so Mike Pence got to spend many hours at Professor Curtis's home discussing these things over beer, and I think that really helped him think through his political leanings, his philosophical leanings, and his understanding of the role of government. Should it be a limited government, or should it be a potent government? And it's those views that have stuck with him to this day.
So he goes to IU School of Law. He has, I think, a similar experience.
Very similar with Professor William Harvey, who I'm sure many people will remember, many Indianapolis lawyers from their own experience in civil procedure. But again, a very powerful mentorship, the ability to discuss constitutional ideas, but more importantly, the role of law. And then Professor Harvey himself got involved in politics. He was nominated to a position by President Reagan and got kind of caught up in the divisive partisan politics of the day. And Mike Pence got to watch how Professor Harvey handled that moment in the public eye that would have been certainly stressful. And Professor Harvey was a significant role model for Mike Pence.
What do you think he learned from that?
Well, probably one, to have a thick skin. You got to have a rhinoceros hide to be in politics. Two, you got to stick with your principles even when you're under attack. Don't tell people what they want to hear. Tell them what you believe, and then pay the consequences.
So after law school, he has a career as a lawyer. He's
very short career as a lawyer.
Yeah, he's really attracted to politics. He runs for the Indiana House. I'm sorry, not the Indiana House, but the U.S. House representing Indiana, I believe, in 98 and 2000?
Well, actually, we're going back to 88 and 90
my fault.
for his first two campaigns,
88 and
that
90.
both unsuccessful.
Right. And the one in 90 is the one that you certainly could argue has been maybe the most important, most influential part of his political career. How so?
Yes, because it was a dirty campaign, and pretty dirty from the start. There were a few episodes that particularly attracted attention. One involved a television ad that showed an Arab American talking in sort of a feigned accent, criticizing Phil Sharp, the incumbent on oil policy, and for which Mike Pence was pilloried both by the Arab American community and Indianapolis Star columnist Dan Carpenter. And then there were other little, I would call them missteps along the way, but the real blunder was a phony push poll that occurred near the end. He wasn't going to win the race. That would have been clear at that point, so why they resorted to this, I don't know. But really it was a deceitful phone survey that was done towards the end of the campaign, in which callers pretended to be organizations that they were not, in order to try to sway vote towards Mike and away from Phil Sharp on environmental and abortion issues. They got caught, and I'm sure they paid some price at the ballot box, but it wasn't discovered until the eve of the election. But what the real price was his reputation. It looked like he'd engaged in really negative, dirty politics at the end, and it was another transformative moment because it forced him to go through a lot of soul searching.
So he's chastened
Yes.
after this election, and again, I mean, it has to do a lot of soul searching about the decisions that he made that were probably against his character. He works for a public policy institute,
Indiana Policy Review.
right? and then goes into radio.
Yes. Before he goes into radio, he writes an apology, not to Phil Sharp, but to the citizenry about his negative campaign. And he swears off negative campaigning in the future, so to speak. He doesn't say, I'm going to return to politics, but he basically says, this is wrong and I wouldn't do it again. So everyone says that was kind of an important first step toward resurrecting a political career.
Right.
Then he does. He starts dabbling in radio while he's still at the Indiana Policy Review, and then he moves into it full time, becomes the host of the Mike Pence radio show, eventually on 18 radio stations around the state of Indiana, and he just has a ball. He's a sort of a Rush Limbaugh lead-in. He called himself Rush Limbaugh on decaf, but he modeled himself quite studiously after Rush at the beginning of this, and by all accounts, his show was popular, well-liked, and fair. He would have guests on from both political parties, and he liked to allow them to debate. It wasn't, how Rush Limbaugh sort of shuts down alternative opinions right away. Mike Pence very carefully avoided that so he could have those opinions aired on his show.
Mm-hmm. And that goes on, I think, from 94 to about 2000. And then we hit one of these just inflection points where some odd things coalesce to open up a road back to politics.
Yeah, serendipitous, really, because it's the same seat that he had wanted a decade earlier. David McIntosh, a Republican, is holding it, but by now it is a majority Republican district, and David McIntosh decides to run for governor, and there's that opening, and so back he goes, running for Congress in 2000, and this time he wins.
If that didn't happen, would he be the Garrison of Indiana still?
I've got to think he would have found a moment. I think the political bug lay deeply within him, and I think there would have been some other moment that would have allowed him to venture back into politics. If not the congressional seat, maybe something at the state level or state representative, but he would have looked for a political stepping stone, I think. Because he says on numerous occasions throughout his life, my dream was always to be an elected member of Congress. Always. And so I don't have him on record saying my dream was always to be president of the United States, but he is on record in numerous instances talking about this deep desire to be in Congress.
Interesting. So he gets into Congress, and he finds pretty quickly that he is an anti-establishment figure within the Republican Party. What happened?
Yeah, absolutely. The Republican Party of Newt Gingrich that attracted him so much originally has gone to being a sort of status quo establishment Republican Party again, spending money that he thinks that the government doesn't have, supporting positions that he doesn't understand, and he does become a rebel within his own caucus. He's able to do it without alienating the caucus in most cases, but he quickly starts to find leadership positions among what I'm going to call the dissenters, the more conservative Republicans. And he doesn't focus on social issues. He focuses on deficit spending and debt and some life issues. I mean, he's pro-life throughout at every opportunity. But what really drives him batty is government spending.
So you had said before that this version of Mike Pence, I mean, is optimum Mike Pence.
I think so. The congressional Mike Pence, yes.
And he's really digging it. And why?
Well, he's digging it because he's advocating the principles that he believes in. He's getting lots of press and attention to his principles. He's making a name for himself so that he can maybe further his own political career, although I think ultimately he's fighting to take back the Republican Party to be the party of limited government. And he's also presenting lots of evidence of that it's not, that it's the big government party. He's taking on the president. He's sitting down with President Bush and able to make his point, whether it's on budgetary spending items, whether it's on health care and that big prescription Medicare entitlement that was enacted when Pence was in Congress. No Child Left Behind. He's taking on Bush on that. He's saying that's not the job of the federal government to run education. So he's doing what he likes doing. He's pursuing public policies that matter, and he's using his communication strategies to do it. Now, he's not winning. A lot of people make the point he never got a bill passed while he was in Congress, but that was never his intent. His intent was to promote these limited government principles.
So eventually this isn't enough. He decides to run for the governorship. Why?
He makes a decision that he's ready to move on. And he seriously considers running for president on at least 2 occasions. And the year he runs for governor, 2012, it just makes more sense to run for governor. And so this is where I'm going to say ambition plays a huge factor. I think he believed that running for governor was the next best step in the evolution of his political career. And I've always felt his real skills were in the federal political arena more than the state arena, and I think his governorship confirmed that was the case.
He discovers that being an executive branch, as it were, is a lot different than being in the legislative branch. How so?
Yeah, so in the legislative branch, you depends on whether you're in the minority or the majority. Yeah. But in his case, regardless of whether Republicans were minority or majority, he was pushing leadership always to try and become more conservative and to rein in government and rein in spending. And that's perfect for the legislative branch. But as an executive, you have to set a vision for the state. You don't get to initiate legislation. You can recommend it, but it's not your job, really. That's the legislative branch's job. And also the executive has lots of dignitary daily functions that are extremely time-consuming. And at least at the beginning, apparently he wasn't that great of a delegator, so he kind of got mixed up in the minutiae of things a lot. So I think being governor was really hard for him. And also as governor, you can't take extreme positions because you've got to have spending, you've got to fix your roads, you've got to fix your bridges, and the state government is the proper place to be doing a lot of the spending. And he felt that all along, by the way. His view on states' rights always was the federal government needs to get out of the business of doing what states can do better, and he didn't object to state spending on legitimate state government activities.
So we get to towards the middle of his term, and there are some smaller peccadillos along the way, but then we get to the big one, which was the religious. Tell me again.
Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Let's just call it RFRA.
Oh, okay. I didn't want us to call it RFRA. But
okay.
We'll call it RFRA. And we've already talked a little bit about it. How did it get away from him?
I don't know. I think that it was destined to get away from him. 30 states had these religious freedom laws, but much had changed since they had been enacted beginning in the 1990s, and the landscape had changed, and those who had supported religious freedom laws earlier no longer did. They originally were viewed as a way that minority religious interests could maintain their rights against government intrusion. And there were a few Supreme Court cases, a little arcane, that kind of changed the way people were looking at it. And then the gay marriage issue came along, and it became clear that once gay marriage was legalized, that now these religious freedom laws might become a tool of the conservative right seeking to maintain a more traditional view of the institution of marriage. And so RFRA laws fell out of favor with what I would consider liberal constituencies. So by the time Indiana introduced RFRA, it was under attack. And there's lots of evidence that national organizations were just waiting for the next state to pass a RFRA law, and they were going to go after it. And it just so happened that Indiana was the next state. There were 2 others in the pipeline. Mm-hmm. So as Brian Bosma says, the opposition was locked and loaded. for whatever reason, the Republicans didn't know that was happening, didn't see it coming, and they fell into a trap. And I would say Mike Pence fell into that trap with them. He signed this bill because he believed in it on the merits. And I think he was absolutely shell-shocked by the reaction. Didn't see it coming.
And the reaction, was national.
And local.
Famously, I'm not sure if the Star had ever done this before, but the entire front page, the entire fold was, is it Fix This Now?
Fix This Now, Governor, or something like that. Yeah.
Right.
And even constituencies that might have supported him on other issues were demanding that something be done. All of the major employers across the state, Cummins and Lilly, and he had conversations with longtime Republicans like Dan Evans, who headed the IU hospital system, who's a conservative Republican, but saying you gotta do it. My employees are saying they're afraid. And so even though Mike Pence himself believed in RFRA, he was unable to articulate the rationale for it in that moment, and the opposition was already ready. So even if he had articulated it better and more clearly and had more examples that had nothing to do with gay marriage, I think that they would have ended up having to rewrite it anyway.
How damaging was this?
Well, it wasn't damaging to his political career.
I think at the time, I think people were saying, "Oh, this guy's washed up."
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I don't think he's an eternal optimist. I don't think he ever thought he was washed up. And I don't think those closest to him ever did either. But certainly pundits and, Tim Swearens at the Star, I know he had an interview with him, and in that column that Tim wrote, he expressed concern that this re-election campaign for governor might be harmed by RFRA. I think RFRA was extremely damaging in the moment, but I think both the governor and the state bounced back quickly.
Donald Trump swoops into town. He becomes the vice president. Your book doesn't cover any element of his service in the White House.
Just the epilogue, which suggests that he is a power player and he's getting his way on a lot of things. And I think whether Supreme Court vacancies or Donald Trump's abortion policy or Donald Trump's Israel policy, I think Mike Pence is extremely influential.
Mm-hmm. What did you learn about him, or what surprised you over the course of writing this book?
Things that I learned about him that I didn't know already. Yeah. One, apparently he's hilarious. Do we see his sense of humor? I don't think we've seen it in a couple decades, but his friends to a person say that he'll have them rolling on the floor in laughter with his very clever jokes, his voice impressions, etc. So I learned that about him. I learned that I think he is a consistent person. So although it's fair to paint him with the brush of ambition, that he still has a core that is consistent and that he's true to, no matter what the political winds are doing. Thus, the RFRA interview with George Stephanopoulos, actually his advisors were telling him not to go on it. Mm-hmm. He said, I need to do this. I need to defend the law, and I need to defend Indiana. So that core of predictability and consistency he's kept with him throughout. Certainly, he's willing sometimes to do things in order to advance his own ambition. So there's nothing inconsistent necessarily about being an evangelical Christian and being a politically ambitious person.
For sure. What ultimately does he want?
What I think his primary vision is for a limited government that mostly stays out of people's lives, lets them do what they want to do, and yet he has some core values that he also would like, abortion being the primary one. He's on record saying that he hopes for the day that Roe v. Wade will be in the ash bin of history. And so his critics would say that shows he's a hypocrite because he says he wants limited government, and then he wants to make access to abortions more difficult or impossible. He would argue that is consistent with his view of government, but that in this instance he views the fetus as having the same right to life as other individuals, and that it's one of government's few jobs is to protect life and liberty, and that includes the baby in the womb.
So, I mean, he'll be keen to probably make some suggestions to President Trump about the next Supreme Court nominee, which we just found out yesterday. There'll be space open.
Yeah, and I think he already has, and I think that Donald Trump will stick to his list of 25 so as not to be accused of some last-minute surprises. But there's no question that Mike Pence has already been influential, and I think Neil Gorsuch probably Pence was very enthusiastic about.
Well, this has been great. Thanks so much, Andrea.
Thank you.
It was a great conversation. My thanks again to Andrea Neal. Her book, Pence, The Path to Power, from Indiana University Press, is available for pre-order now via Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and IU Press. Its release date is August the 1st. Now, if you want something to read right now, head over to the IBJ website and check out Lindsay Erdity's story this week about the dozens of Hoosiers who are serving in the Trump administration with Mike Pence, including our Surgeon General, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Secretary of Health and Human Services. This healthy crop of policymakers is an obvious reflection of Mike Pence's influence on the administration and Trump's choices for political appointments. It's also the lead story in this week's print edition of IBJ, if you want the paper version instead. In the meantime, thanks for listening. I'm Mason King, and we'll be back next week.